Welcome to Ananya Bhakti, and this is where wisdom meets conversation. Join me as we explore life, culture, and stories that matter. Hit subscribe and let's begin the journey.
Today, we're diving into the Vedic age of ancient India. It's an incredible story of transformation, really, a tale of how a society of nomadic herders became the builders of complex, settled kingdoms, and they did it all in just a few centuries.
So that's the big question we're tackling here. How on earth does a society of semi-nomadic cattle herders totally reinvent itself? We're talking about their economy, their politics, their social structure, even the gods they worship, all in less than 1,000 years. How does that happen?
All right, let's get our bearings. The Vedic age runs from about 1500 to 600 BCE, but the real key to understanding this whole era is that split, right there in the middle, around 1000 BCE. We're calling it the Great Shift, and it's the turning point that basically divides our story into two completely different acts, the early period and the later period. So, before we get into the story, we've got to ask, why is it even called the Vedic age in the first place? Well, the answer is in the books, you could say, the foundational texts that are pretty much our only window into this ancient world. Yep, the period gets its name from the Vedas. Now, these aren't just religious texts. They're these huge collections of hymns, prayers, rituals, and philosophical ideas. Honestly, they give us almost everything we know about these people, their beliefs, their daily lives, and the very fabric of their society. There are four main collections. You've got the Rigved, which is the oldest and our main source for that early period. But the others are just as cool. The Yajurveda has all the specific instructions for sacrifices. The Samaveda is basically a songbook with verses set to music. And the Atharvaveda, well, that one's full of spells and charms for everyday life. It's an amazing snapshot. Okay, so let's set the stage for Act 1, the early Vedic or Rigvedic period. This first half of our story shows us a society that is, and I mean this, fundamentally different from everything that came after. So picture this. During this time, people lived in tribes called jana. They weren't building big cities. They were semi-nomadic, moving around with their precious herds of cattle. Their whole world was centered in the Sapta Sindhu, the land of 7 rivers, up in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent. Life was all about kinship and the tribe, not about territory or some powerful king. And here's a really important social feature of the time, the role of women. They actually held a pretty respectable position. They could take part in tribal assemblies, and some, like Lopamudra and Gosa, were celebrated poets. So celebrated, in fact, that their hymns made it into the sacred Rigveda itself. Now remember that because it's going to change dramatically. So what happened? What was the spark that ended this way of life and set the stage for a completely new society? Well, it all kicked off with a huge migration and a game-changing piece of technology. Right around that 1000 BCE mark, there's this major movement of people eastward into the super fertile plains between the Ganga and Yamuna rivers. This whole area was covered in dense forest, but now they had a new tool, iron. Iron axes meant they could clear the land and start large-scale, settled farming for the very first time. This was the engine that changed everything. And that brings us to Act 2, the later Vedic period. See, this shift of farming wasn't just a change in jobs. It fundamentally re-engineered their entire civilization. It created a whole new rulebook for how society worked. This table just lays it all out, doesn't it? The scale of the change is massive. Society goes from being relatively egalitarian and tribal to being stratified and territorial as actual kingdoms start to form. The Varna system, the 4 main classes, that goes from being kind of flexible and based on your job to being super rigid and hereditary. You were born into it. And the status of women, it plummeted. As land became the source of wealth, their public roles just got squeezed out. It was a complete top-to-bottom overhaul. The engine behind all this social upheaval was this fundamental economic shift. In the early days, wealth was mobile. It was all about cattle. But with settled farming, wealth becomes stationary. It's now tied to the land, which you can own, you can tax, and you can pass down for generations. that one change had absolutely massive consequences. And of course, this change in wealth leads directly to a change in power. The early tribal chieftain, the Rajan, had pretty limited authority. But now, with territories to rule and land taxes to collect, you see the rise of powerful hereditary kings who would prove their authority with these huge, elaborate sacrifices. So what's the casualty of all this? Well, a direct consequence was that those earlier, more democratic groups, the tribal assemblies known as the Sabha and Samiti, where people actually had a voice, they just lost their influence. As the king's power went up, theirs went way down. This transformation was so total, it even reached up into the heavens. In the early pastoral period, the most important gods totally reflected their world. They were forces of nature and war. Indra, the god of thunder and war, was the top dog, perfect for a tribal society always on the move, right? And Agni, the god of fire, was the crucial messenger between humans and the gods. But fast forward to the settled agricultural world of the later Vedic period, and the whole divine org chart gets completely reorganized. Indra and Agni, they lose their top spots. New gods, reflecting new concerns, rise to the top. Prajapati, the creator. Vishnu, the preserver of cosmic order. And Rudra, an early form of the god Shiva. And, with new gods come new ways to worship. Religion shifted away from simple hymns and fire offerings to these incredibly complex and expensive rituals that could last for days on end. This, in turn, just massively elevated the status and power of the Brahmana, the priestly class, because they were the only ones who knew how to perform these rituals correctly. So, when you put it all together, what you see is a complete and total transformation. The real legacy of this age isn't one single static culture, but the incredible story of how that culture profoundly reinvented itself. So let's just trace that path one last time. You start with mobile tribes based on kinship. Then comes the catalyst: migration, iron tools, and agriculture. That leads directly to settled kingdoms with complex social ladders. And finally, this brand new reality forges new social rules, new politics, and even new gods. In the end, the story of the Vedic age is just one of incredible evolution. A society of pastoralists literally remade itself into a society of farmers and kings, and in doing so, laid the social, political, and religious groundwork for all the great civilizations that would follow in India. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. It's one thing to see how a society changes, but it's another to think about the echoes. How did these ancient shifts in hierarchy, in government, and in belief create the very foundations upon which millennia of history would then be built?
Thank you, beloved soul, for joining the path of devotion. May this space be filled with divine peace, wisdom, and light. Until we meet again. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Ananya Bhakti.